1980, a beer so cheap, so rough, and so unapologetically working class that it became both a legend and a punchline. Boxer. The beer your buddy drank when his EI ran out. The beer that tasted like regret but cost less than a pack of smokes. But here's what nobody tells you. Boxer wasn't hated because it was bad. It was hated because it told the truth about who was drinking it. And I'm going to show you exactly why it mattered. I was 16 when I first tried Boxer. My uncle handed me one at a family barbecue, grinned, and said, "This'll put hair on your chest." It tasted like metal and regret, but I drank it because that's what you did. You didn't complain about Boxer, you just drank it and got on with your day. Boxer wasn't created to be loved. It was created to be affordable. And in the late 1970s and early 1980s, affordable mattered more than taste. Boxer was brewed by Carling O'Keeffe, one of Canada's big breweries, and launched as a budget brand specifically targeting working-class men who couldn't afford premium beer but still wanted to drink. The name said it all. Boxer. Tough, no-nonsense, blue-collar. The can was plain, the marketing was minimal, and the price was the lowest on the shelf. A case of Boxer cost about half what you'd pay for Labatt Blue or Molson Canadian. And for a lot of Canadian men in the early 80s, that price difference wasn't a choice. It was survival. To understand why Boxer succeeded, you need to understand the early 1980s in Canada. The recession hit hard, unemployment spiked, factories closed, and working-class families were squeezed. The men who'd worked in mills, factories, and construction sites, their whole lives were suddenly out of work or working reduced hours. But they still wanted to drink. They still wanted to sit on the porch after a long day, crack open a cold one, and feel like they had something. Boxer gave them that. Boxer appeared in every corner store, every beer store, every place that sold cheap beer to men who needed it. The cans were stacked high, always the cheapest option, always available. The taste was rough, nobody pretended otherwise. It was thin, metallic, with a bitter aftertaste that lingered. But it was cold, it was beer, and it was affordable. That was enough. Boxer became the beer of necessity. Construction workers would buy a case on Friday and make it last the weekend. Guys working under the table would grab a six-pack with their cash earnings. Teenagers would pool their money and buy Boxer because it was all they could afford. It wasn't aspirational, it wasn't cool, but it was real. And for a certain segment of Canadian men, Boxer was their beer, whether they liked it or not. But here's where it gets interesting. Boxer developed a culture around it, a dark humor that acknowledged exactly what it was. Guys would joke about it. Drinking Boxer? Things must be tough. Boxer, the beer that fights back. I'd rather drink Boxer than nothing, but it's close. The jokes were part of the experience, a way of acknowledging that you were drinking bottom-shelf beer without pretending it was anything else. At parties, Boxer was the beer you brought if you were broke or if you didn't care what people thought. It was the beer in the garage fridge, the beer at the hunting camp, the beer at the rink after men's league hockey. And here's the thing, there was a weird pride in drinking Boxer. Not pride in the taste, but pride in not giving a damn. Pride in being the guy who'd drink anything, pride in being working class and not apologizing for it. Boxer drinkers weren't trying to impress anyone. They were just trying to get through the week. Let's talk about what Boxer actually tasted like, because if you drank it, you remember. That first sip hit you with metal. Not just a hint of metallic taste, but full-on pennies-in-your-mouth metal, like you were licking the side of the can. It was thin, watery, with a harsh bitterness that had nothing to do with hops and everything to do with whatever cheap ingredients went into it. But here's the thing. By the third sip, your mouth adjusted. The metal faded, the bitterness became background noise, and it just became beer. Cold, wet, alcoholic beer. You didn't savor Boxer. You didn't sip it slowly whilst contemplating the flavor notes. You drank it functionally, mechanically, the way you'd drink water after mowing the lawn. And the hangover. God, the Boxer hangover was its own special hell. Not the pounding headache you'd get from good beer drunk too fast, but a dull, grinding ache that sat behind your eyes and made your whole body feel like it was made of rust. You'd wake up with a taste in your mouth, like you'd been chewing aluminum foil, and no amount of coffee would wash it away. But you drank it anyway because it was what you could afford. And if you remember the exact price of a case of Boxer in 1983, drop it in the comments. Let's see who actually drank it versus who just heard the jokes. But Boxer's affordability came with a cost, its reputation. Boxer became synonymous with being broke, being desperate, being at the bottom. It was the beer of last resort, the beer you drank when you'd run out of options. The jokes got meaner. Boxer, for when you've given up. Boxer, because dignity is expensive. I wouldn't feed Boxer to my dog. The brand became a punchline, and everyone knew it. Carling O'Keefe barely advertised Boxer. There were no TV commercials, no sponsorships, no attempts to make it cool. The marketing strategy was simple: make it cheap, make it available, and let necessity do the rest. And for a while that worked. Boxer sold consistently through the early and mid-'80s, not because people loved it, but because people needed it. But here's what nobody knew at the time. Boxer wasn't actually worse beer than the premium brands. It was the same beer, just packaged differently. Industry insiders later revealed that Boxer was brewed using the same equipment, same water, same basic process as Carling's other beers. The difference was in the ingredients: cheaper grains, less hops, faster fermentation, but the gap in quality wasn't as massive as the gap in price suggested. Boxer tasted rough because it was designed to be cheap, not because the brewery didn't know how to make better beer. They knew exactly what they were doing, creating a product for people who couldn't afford anything else. And that's what made Boxer both successful and hated. It was a reminder of economic reality, a liquid symbol of being working class in a country that was supposed to be prosperous. By the late 1980s, things were changing. The economy recovered. Unemployment dropped. The men who'd been drinking Boxer out of necessity started having choices again. And when they had choices, they chose anything else. The beer market was also shifting. Imported beers were becoming popular. Microbreweries were emerging. Even mainstream brands like Molson and Labatt were introducing premium lines. Beer was becoming about taste, about experience, about identity. Boxer had no place in that world. It represented everything the new beer culture was trying to move away from: cheapness, roughness, desperation. Sales started dropping. The men who'd drunk Boxer in the early 80s were now drinking Canadian or Blue or even imported brands. Boxer was left with a shrinking market of people who still couldn't afford anything else, and that market wasn't big enough to sustain it. Carling O'Keefe tried minor reformulations, slight price adjustments, but nothing worked. Boxer's reputation was too damaged, too associated with hard times and bad taste. So what really killed Boxer? Here's the brutal truth. We killed it. And not just by choosing other beers when we could afford them. We actively, viciously mocked Boxer out of existence because we were ashamed we'd ever needed it. We made it a punchline because admitting we'd drunk it meant admitting we'd been broke. We told jokes about Boxer drinkers being losers because we didn't want anyone to remember we'd been those losers. We turned it into a symbol of failure because we were desperate to prove we weren't failures anymore. The cruelty was the point. Every Boxer joke was a way of saying, "I'm not that guy anymore. I'm better than that now." We didn't just stop drinking Boxer when times got better. We turned on it, mocked it, made sure everyone knew we'd moved on to better things. Drinking Boxer meant admitting you were broke. It meant admitting you couldn't afford better. It meant wearing your economic status on your sleeve or in your hand, in the form of a plain can with a Boxer logo. When the economy recovered and men had choices again, they didn't just choose to forget. They chose to mock, to distance themselves, to make absolutely certain nobody thought they were still Boxer drinkers. And here's the controversial part. Maybe we were wrong to treat it that way. Maybe a beer that was honest about being cheap, that didn't pretend to be something it wasn't, that served working-class men without judgment, maybe that beer deserved better than to become a punchline. Boxer didn't lie to you. It didn't promise premium taste at budget prices. It was exactly what it claimed to be: affordable beer for men who needed affordable beer. And we hated it for telling that truth. By the early 1990s, Boxer was effectively dead. Carling O'Keefe had merged with Molson in 1989, and the new company had no interest in maintaining a budget brand with a terrible reputation. Production was quietly discontinued, and Boxer disappeared from shelves. There was no announcement, no farewell, no acknowledgement that a beer that had served thousands of Canadian men through hard times was gone. It just vanished, and most people didn't notice or care. The few who did notice were the men who'd relied on Boxer when they had nothing else. And for them, losing Boxer meant losing one of the last affordable options in a beer market that was increasingly focused on premium products. Today, Boxer is remembered as a joke. Remember Boxer? That beer was terrible. Boxer, the worst beer in Canadian history. The stories are always the same: how bad it tasted, how desperate you had to be to drink it, how glad everyone is that it's gone. But here's what those stories miss. Boxer mattered to the men who drank it, not because it tasted good, but because it was there when they needed it. Boxer represented a time when a lot of Canadian men were struggling, when the economy was brutal, when work was scarce and money was tight. It was the beer you drank when you couldn't afford anything else, and it didn't judge you for that. The men who drank Boxer weren't losers or failures. They were men dealing with circumstances beyond their control, trying to maintain some small pleasure in difficult times. And Boxer gave them that. My uncle died in 2003. At his funeral, someone made a Boxer joke. Remember how he used to drink that swill? Everyone laughed, including me. It wasn't until years later that my aunt told me the truth. He drank Boxer through the early 80s, not because he liked it, but because it was all he could afford. He was out of work for 18 months, and every dollar mattered. He drank Boxer so his kids could have school clothes, so the mortgage got paid, so the family stayed together. And we made jokes about it at his funeral. That's what Boxer really represents. Not bad beer, but hard choices. Not poor taste, but economic reality. Not failure, but survival. The rise and fall of Boxer is a story about class, about economic reality, and about how we remember hard times. Boxer succeeded because it served a need: affordable beer for working-class men during a recession. It failed because when times got better, those same men wanted to forget they'd ever needed it. We didn't kill Boxer because it tasted bad. We killed it because it reminded us of a time we'd rather forget. A time when we were broke, when work was scarce, when we drank cheap beer because that's all we could afford. And maybe that's the real tragedy. Not that Boxer died, but that we were so eager to forget the men who drank it and the times that made it necessary. Did you drink Boxer? Do you remember those early 80s when times were tough and Boxer was all you could afford? Or were you the guy who made jokes about it whilst drinking something else? Drop your Boxer stories in the comments. Tell us the truth about what it was like, about why you drank it, about whether you miss it or you're glad it's gone. And if this hit you with memories of harder times and cheaper beer, hit that like button and subscribe, because we've got more stories about the Canada we remember, the good and the bad, the proud and the embarrassing. Thanks for watching, and remember, the worst beer you ever drank might have been the most honest beer you ever had.